It took me 4 takes to record this intro to this video, and it's really ticking me off. So you know what? Let's come right back and talk a little bit about living with anger. Like every single human emotion, every single one of them serves a purpose. I know that we don't like some of them. I know that they're difficult to understand sometimes, but anger is one of those things. And, in the intro, we talk about living with anger versus anger management. The reason why I say living with anger opposed to anger management is because we're trying to coexist with it. We're not trying to make it go away. We're not trying to suppress it. We're not trying to, turn it off because it has a value and it serves a purpose. So part of today is to understand its purpose and why it's there and help us to coexist with it and what that means for us. So the first thing we need to do is just understand anger as an emotion and what it is and why we have it. And when we see, things like hate crimes and violence and things happening in our community, we go, there's no place for anger. It doesn't serve us. And that's a misrepresentation of what it is and, how it's being expressed. And it can be very harmful and hurtful, of course, but at the same time, it's a tool that's useful in our emotional toolbox that helps us to do certain things. And it's not so much about the anger itself, it's how it's interpreted or the actions that we take as a result of the anger. So we ask, what is anger? And some professionals would suggest that it's more of a secondary emotion. And what they mean by that is the anger is normally fueled or can be fueled by something else. And I think all of us have had similar experiences where there's something that's bothering you or upsetting you and you let it go. Maybe you feel hurt or you feel sad. One of the descriptive handouts that you'll see in the social service and psychological world is something called an anger iceberg, and it's a picture as you would see an iceberg, the tip of it sticking above the water, and it's anger, and below the water there's this gambit of emotions, and as the iceberg is labeled underneath the water. Underneath there's all these other emotions, and like I was saying, a lot of us have had these experiences where somebody bugs you enough or irritates you enough or lies to you enough or does something that causes hurt or sadness. And they kind of do it over and over again, or that experience happens over and over again until we get to the place where we become angry. And our anger is fueled by the other emotions not being managed or taken care of in a healthy way. I remember in high school, there was a guy who would, he had boots on. He sat next to me in math class, and he'd just flip over with his steel-toe boots, and he'd come over and he'd tap my shin with the tap of with his boot, and he would tap my shin, and it was not very comfortable. But he'd do that every day, and I would kind of let it go, and I felt a little bullied, a little ashamed, and a little whatever, and whatever those feelings were. And then it built up over time, and then finally that emotion got to a place where one day he did that, and I got very angry and I got upset, and it turned into aggression, and it turned into some other things, and probably a trip to the principal's office. But the point being is that if I had managed the expectation of those emotions or set some boundaries or communicated in a way with that young man or moved my chair or something, I might have avoided getting to that state. But it was more the underlying emotions that built up that led to that anger. So like I said, many professionals would suggest that anger is not always what we think it is. Sometimes it's underlying things. So we want to ask the question of, what is it that led me to that anger? Was it some other feeling or emotion that was unresolved? Another reason for anger or a purpose of anger is to fight injustice. So sometimes we see people getting upset and angry when someone's being treated poorly. We have a history of war in the human race, and some of it's done over injustice. It's done over protecting others or democracy or freedom. So if we didn't do that, we would be, um, you know, we wouldn't be here as a species. We would have just kind of very passively sat around and waited for our demise. So it's critical and important for us to understand that. It's part of that fighting injustice. Even now in today's world, we have plenty of injustices that are happening, and we see a lot of people stepping into those injustices, and and rightfully a lot of them are fueled by anger, and that's okay. Um, and it's and using those makes a lot of sense to be able to uh, uh, give ourselves some motivation and some direction, and sometimes a little bit of anger is okay. So we're just kind of setting the stage to recognize it is really, really normal for us to have some sense of anger. And it's part of the human um, experience to have that. And that's why we want to, clarify that we're trying to figure out how to coexist with it. And the bigger problem that we have is not so much the anger, it's distinguishing the difference between anger and the action that comes as a result of anger. So, um, that same example of me getting upset with, a fellow student in the classroom, uh, that going to the principal's office, and it was a long time ago, but if I do recall, um, the principal told me that wasn't okay to get angry like that, and it was not about the anger; it was my actions as a result of the anger. I'm allowed to be angry; that's okay. And we see that right across um, through schools and television and all media sources that tell us that anger is not okay. But really, it is. It is really important. It's the action. So we struggle with trying to see the difference between the emotion of how I'm feeling and the actions that I take as a result. The actions very often are inappropriate or not okay and can be harmful and hurtful. And it's not until we can understand the difference between these two, which is a major part of learning to live with anger, or some programs, the anger management process is really truly understanding what that is and what that is for you, and being able to decipher it. So those injustices that we feel, or the underlying emotions, need to be established and understood for ourselves so that we can recognize where that anger is coming from and the value that it's trying to provide to help me to, find my existence and find what is important to me. So anger plays a role in all of that. I've said it before and I've said it again, that emotions are more like an idiot light, they call them. Little lights that flash on your dashboard in your car, the check engine light, the oil light. They pop on to show you that there's something wrong. It doesn't necessarily mean that the car's falling apart or things are broken or you have to take action. It's just kind of telling you that there's something not right, or there's something that needs to change, or there's a direction that needs to happen. Same with even indicator signals and all that stuff. They're just telling us direction. They're guiding us through that process. So anger is like that. It's like a check engine light that pops on. And it's really important, like I was already saying, to be able to understand what that check engine light means for you. But more importantly, we need to recognize the signs of the anger that might lead to those actions that we were talking about. So if you see a pattern of action that you're taking that's inappropriate, that could be yelling, or um, uh, being cruel or mean, whatever it may be, that your anger might be harmful to your relationships and your well-being, and your future, then it's a good idea to say, what are my check engine lights? What are the idiot lights that pop on for me? And just, that's what they're actually called. They're actually called idiot lights. I'm not saying anybody's an idiot. Um, so when these lights pop on, we are strongly encouraged to figure out when they're popping on. And part of the thing that I noticed in my own life in active addiction over the years, my self-awareness with my body and my emotional state was very small, because I was always in a place of trying to emotionally numb and turn things off. So my self-awareness to sensations in my body and things that were happening weren't necessarily lined up with what I thought they were. So when I started practicing a life of abstinence and getting better, I started recognizing that there were sensations, there was things happening in my mind, in my body, in my central nervous system, and I could feel it. So one of the ways that is critical to understanding how to live with anger is to identify it in yourself. And we do that through creating some self-awareness to what's going on inside our body. So you can grab a pen and paper and you can write down, what are some of the things that go through my head? What are some of the thoughts that I have when I'm angry? Um, and normally they're going, for me anyway, and not everyone, they could be aggressive. They could be, you know what, this is crap, or it could be, swearing. It could be agitation. It could be blaming or pointing fingers at people. That person's wrong. How dare they? What's wrong with that? And we can see some of the thoughts that we end up having as a result of feeling the sensation of anger. We can also then look at the physiological symptoms, right? What happens to your body? Think about it for a minute. What happens to your body when you start recognizing that signs of anger are starting to come? Luckily, with this process, I personally have been able to see and sense and be able to look at somebody and say, you know what, I'm starting to get angry. And I think maybe this conversation should end right now, or should walk away or take a break, because I'm feeling these sensations. And for me, it's shallowed breathing. You can feel a muscle tension, maybe a little bit of clenching of the jaw or tension in there, squinting eyes, increased heart rate. You can feel those things happening within your body, and it's not until we recognize them and see them. And each person's going to be different. I've had people say that their back gets tight, or their chest gets tight, or they recognize muscle tension in very specific places. So it's unique to you. So it's important to just kind of write down, what are the things that I recognize as physical symptoms when it comes to the anger, and then what about some of the actions that you normally take? What are some of the things that you do to recognize that you're getting angry? Some people might pace. Some people will isolate. They'll, turtle, kind of hide in on themselves and be like, I'm angry, just leave me alone and go away. Recognizing some of those things, those actions that we take and the things that we do. I tap my leg starts bouncing. I'll fidget, I'll click a pen, I will do something, play with my watch when I'm finding myself agitated. And those are signs and symptoms to me to recognize that I'm building up and there's something else going on there. And sometimes we don't recognize it because of what we already talked about before, is it could be underlying emotions or other things going on, and I don't know that I'm building up to that. So understanding some of the thought patterns, the physical sensations, the emotions that are happening within inside my body, and some of the actions I take are going to be my idiot light. And I can start recognizing those. So jotting them down creates a more conscious awareness of them. So when I see them on a piece of paper, the next time I feel those, I'll be like, oh, I know what's going on here. I can recognize that. And then that allows us to create early intervention, or figure out how to live with that anger, or what are the things that I need to put into play to be able to manage that in a safe way. So like I said earlier, there can be a build to the idea of getting angry, or feeling a sensation of anger. And it's not always as clear as we might think, and it could build up to that space. And there is an adage, or an understanding of something called the frog in a pot. And what it is uh, a frog is a cold-blooded creature, so it doesn't recognize slight temperature changes because it's cold-blooded, whereas a human being, a slight temperature change in the room, and we're like, what's the thermostat at? And it's like a half a degree off, and we notice, whereas in short increments, a cold-blooded creature doesn't recognize that. So the frog in a pot analogy is the idea of, if you put a cold-blooded creature, a frog, in a pot, and the water's cold, it will adapt to that temperature. But if you turn the temperature up slowly on that pot, the frog wouldn't recognize the temperature changes over slow increments. And eventually the temperature would get so hot that the frog would expire from the temperature without jumping out of the pot. And don't worry, no animals were harmed in the making of this analogy. But the analogy is relevant to anger and emotional regulation in individuals around us. And um, the reason being is that we end up in a space and an environment where we dictate what normal is. And then that normal slowly changes so much that we don't recognize that it's changing until it's too late. So anger can be the same way, where there's these slow incremental changes, these little things that are happening, and we don't recognize they're happening. And as they're happening, they end up building up, building up, building up until it's too late. So part of anger management is also creating self-awareness and understanding that just because I feel this anger, but that's what my normal life is, doesn't mean I ignore it. So, for instance, in my own life, I've got a bunch of activities and a bunch of things happening, and I normally do. But I've also been doing those activities for a very long period of time. That level of stress from those activities are building up and creating more emotional agitation within myself. Uh, but if you were to ask me, Dean, is it too much? I would say, no, I've always worked this much. I've always had these many projects. I've always had that. But the buildup of being, always being in that space starts to build up, and it turns into over agitation or frustration, and that can be pressing on my limitations. Right. There's also the analogy of a bottle and pop, we call it. So if you imagine a bottle of soda with carbonation inside, and then we constantly shake this bottle of pop over and over and over again, and then we decide that we want to express ourselves or do or say something, we open this bottle of pop, and what happens? Well, it sprays everywhere. And that's when anger turns into action or inappropriate action. And it can be very problematic. From the addiction world, what we often see is individuals will be overly passive or suppress those emotions that are happening, bottle and pop them throughout the week or during downtimes or during the day, and then they leave those emotions in check, and suppressed until they get to a place of substance use, and then they're given permission to express those things. So you'll sometimes see individuals that will be very passive in their day-to-day life. They won't set boundaries, they won't communicate, they won't do these things in their own life, and they won't stand up for their own rights or their own injustices, and they'll ignore them, ignore them, ignore them, ignore them, and then get intoxicated, and then get violent or aggressive because all of those suppressed emotions come out while they're intoxicated, because their inhibitions are reduced or their central nervous system is numbed enough so that they don't care about the consequences. And so then that anger can turn into something bigger. So it's really important to recognize that, not only in active addiction, but outside of active addiction, because if that's the coping strategy we used in active addiction, we'll likely have the same coping strategy in recovery. And in recovery, we can just ignore, 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 ignore. But then there's no release because we're not getting intoxicated to allow for that release. And then that suppressed anger over a long period of time can turn into um, ailments. It can turn into physical sensations. It can eventually turn into you getting really angry at something that you don't necessarily need to get angry at. Um, and it can be the smallest of things that can set that off. And I hear people talking about those things that are bothering them. They got all these stresses in their life. And then, um, a friend told me a story of a broken shoelace, ignoring all the things in life and then tying up shoes, and then the shoelace broke, while tying up the shoes. And that was the straw that broke the camel's back that, sent them back out into active addiction. Meanwhile, there was all these other things that they weren't paying attention to. And that was the thing that, kind of opened the bottle of pop, so to speak, and things got worse. So it's really important to recognize that it's not always some big grandiose thing. Anger isn't just a one-time deal. It can be things that have accumulated over a long period of time, and it's really important to manage that accumulation on a regular basis to avoid that explosion later, or the big, huge emotional charge that can lead to actions and words and things that you might regret. So there are different ways to recognize living with anger. Like we said, first and foremost, is identification, recognizing it, what it is, why it's important. And then there's things that we can do in two different ways. There's things that we can do in the moment when we recognize that those early warning signs are in place and we're feeling a sense of anger coming on. And then there's also prevention and long-term care and things that we can do over time. So we'll talk about the short-term ones now, and we'll talk a little bit about the long-term after. But in the short term, we can recognize those early warning signs, and then we can see that there's physiological and psychological things happening within our body. So if we can start to change some of those physiological and psychological phenomenons, some of the thinking that's happening, then we've got a really good chance of interrupting that. I remember an occupational therapist told me some time ago that the mind needs to match the body. And I struggled with it at first, but he very eloquently put, if the mind is calm, then the body has to follow. And if the body is calm, the mind has to follow. So if my mind is racing, my body will start to race my heart and speed up my heart rate, etc. If my body is racing and I've drank too much coffee, which I probably have, and my heart starts racing and my breathing shallows, then my mind will try to match my body. If I'm in an anxious state, my mind is going to say, what do I have to be anxious about? I need to think about all the things and what's the problem here. So the early intervention in that moment is trying to figure out how to soothe either one of those things is a great preventative measure. So some people will do things like counting to 10. And counting to 10 or something of that nature allows me to redirect my thought process to something specific. So that could be a grounding or a mindfulness strategy. So I could look around the room and I can count things that are yellow maybe, and I can look around and go, where are all the yellow things? There's an extension cord, there's a ladder, there's a mop bucket, there's some emergency tape, there's a clip on a box. While I'm doing that, my mind is not in the space of thinking about what it is that I'm angry about, and it's not regurgitating that sensation. While I'm looking at these things, my body says, oh, my mind must be pretty calm. If I'm sitting here counting yellow stuff, then it should probably be pretty calm. So then my heart rate will start to decrease and my breathing will go down. And then we can interrupt that explosive emotional charge of anger through the process of being mindful. That is one example. There's things that can work for everyone in different ways. There could be mantras or sayings. People in recovery that I know, a lot of them like to use certain prayers or serenity prayer. I know religious people that will have mantras or chants that they use, that sort of thing, that help them to get grounded. And then their mind says, if my mind is doing this, I must be okay. So there's a bunch of things that we recommend that you go look into some of those strategies. And then there's slowing down the body, slowing it down through the process of taking breathing and doing some breathing strategies. If I slow my breathing, naturally my heart rate starts to follow because it's pumping the oxygen around my body. This heart rate and the breathing slow down. It helps to regulate my central nervous system and help me feel a little bit more safe because I can't possibly be in danger or need to be angry if my heart rate is slow and my body's slowing. And it also gives me something to focus my mind on. So it's doing both. So if I'm thinking about my breathing, I'm not thinking about the other problem. I'm focused on my breathing. So there's different types of breathing strategies you can do, or you even count your breathing in and out. I encourage everyone to go look deeper into those things and how they work. And it's also very preventative. So if we practice breathing strategies or these type of mindful activities on a very regular basis, not just when we're in crisis, we'll talk about prevention again. It can help us to get into that state easier when we're heightened. So it's important to learn how to manage, in the moment. One of the things that I will give caution to is people used to believe that when you're angry, that if you went and did an act of aggression, you punched something, you punched a punching bag, that it would then help you to feel better. there's certainly a cathartic release to, having an adrenaline punch or something like that. However, experts have shown that it actually reinforces the idea that when I'm angry, I'm supposed to be aggressive. And depending on the situation, sometimes it is appropriate. If I'm defending my life or I'm defending, the injustice of somebody else, maybe that's appropriate. Um, but most of the time it's not. So when I keep saying if a person goes and punches something as a result of their anger, it starts to rewire the neural pathways to say that's okay, that's a normal response. So in trying to manage anger later, it's a lot more difficult to not act out in some physical way when trying to manage the anger. It's much better to try and get the anger and redirect it into a more peaceful state. And then that allows us a little bit more control. And the brain starts rewiring itself to say, I don't really need to go there unless I have to. And it gives us a little bit more control. In the addiction world, there's also the reward piece. So it's very strange that when we get emotionally dysregulated, in active addiction and we feel a big emotional charge, anger being one of those, or whatever the underlying emotion is, we get stuck in those emotional states. Um, we teach our central nervous system that when I get emotionally charged, I get a reward. I get to go use my drug. I get to go drink. So the idea is that we would get angry and then justify it. So then we start having a negative reward system. So if I get angry, that gives me permission to go do what I want to do. So it's important that we learn how to regulate those emotions in the moment and take responsibility for how we feel so that it doesn't turn into dysfunctional avoidance. Sometimes avoidance is okay, going and getting distracted and doing something in a healthy way, but addiction is more of an unhealthy avoidance of me just going and finding something else to do my work for me, and then that becomes the pattern and it turns into a negative reinforcement. So certainly a caution. It's really important that we don't get surprised by having anger in the future. Just because we're doing anger management doesn't mean that it goes away. And what can happen in life is we think we're doing well with it and it's not present. And then we get surprised by some activity or event from our past that we didn't see coming. And then that can kind of take us off our game. And I know me personally, I've gotten angry at myself for being angry because I thought that I wasn't supposed to be in that moment. So it's really important when we're planning these long-term things that there's no expectation of not ever being in that place because it very likely could happen. And we need to recognize that we don't always have all of the things going on in our life at once to be able to practice that. So we will get surprised by events and activities that we've never experienced before or we haven't experienced for a long time. So looking at the long-term prevention, it's really all about um, doing regular pattern things to take care of your emotional state on a regular basis, right? So journaling, talking to professionals, all of those things that we just talked about, regular meditation and mindfulness helps to regulate our central nervous system. And then it's like a fire alarm. We practice doing a fire drill when there's no actual fire, so we know what to do when it happens. And prevention is a lot like that. It's saying, what am I practicing and how am I practicing it when I'm not in a worry of acting out in anger? And how do I practice those things when things are okay so that when it comes to me feeling angry, I have the tools to interrupt that process and can move a little bit forward in a healthier way. So remember, living with anger is really important, and we're figuring out how to coexist with it and its role that it plays in your recovery. So remember to practice and understand these things in a healthy way, and we'll see you next time.